Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, July 31st, 2023, and today we are going to be talking about the Cook Political Report and a brand new race ratings release on the 2024 Electoral College map. Now, on your screen right now, you see the Cook Political Report's presidential race ratings. They have characterizations from solid Democrat, likely Democrat, lean Democrat, toss-up, and the rest for the Republican Party. And one major takeaway that we can see from here is that the toss-up column is very narrow. Immediately, my eyes jumped to the center of the screen where we see that some of the most competitive races have boiled down to just simply 4 races: Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. The 3 other columns give us a general idea, at least from the perspective of the Cook Political Report, as to where these states are going to go. For instance, the state of Alabama is in the solid Republican column, and the state of California is in the solid Democratic column. But the interesting thing about this is that even some of the states that were more competitive back in 2020 also share a characterization that seems to indicate that they are leaning in one way versus the other. For instance, the state of North Carolina, the ever-competitive swing state that Democrats have only won in 2008 through 1976 and 2020, one time in 2008, it's always competitive, but generally goes to the Republican Party, and seemingly so, the Cook Political Report recognizes that and puts it in the lean Republican column. Now, you also might remember the hype around the state of Michigan and Nevada back in 2020, the vote being tabulated in Nevada, the comeback for Joe Biden in Michigan, and these 2 states start out as a lean Democrat states together, with 21 total electoral votes in that column for President Joe Biden. Now, this doesn't do it justice in terms of an overall electoral map, so we're going to head over to 270 to win, where we have this map here that helps you visualize it a bit more as to how these ratings are. So far, the Republican Party starts out with roughly 148 electoral votes. Democrats start out with roughly 209 electoral votes. Democrats start out with 247 when you include likely and lean states. Republicans are at 235. So already this election is more competitive than the last. The Republicans are already slightly further than where they were back in the 2020 election when Donald Trump lost the race to Joe Biden. And looking at our map here, there are roughly 56 electoral votes. I already mentioned this. The 4 states that will boil down to being the most important ones for this election cycle: Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. Make sure to watch those states as we move ahead into the future, because these will be where almost all of the battleground campaigning will begin. And seeing where we are today, Democrats do have a narrow advantage over the GOP, but regardless, since this race is so close, it truly could go in either direction. I think that the general understanding as to how some of these races are going to go is rooted in this idea that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have these bases that will turn out in 2024 in the same way they turned out in 2020. We aren't seeing much variation from the 2020 presidential map because that's simply how American politics is these days. We've become an increasingly higher polarized country where you really find it difficult to see how any states are going to swing, especially when faced, in this possibility it seems, with the frontrunners on both sides of the aisle, of a rematch between President Donald Trump, who is going to be the Republican nominee, assuming that these numbers hold, and President Joe Biden, who as the incumbent will easily be the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. Looking at our prediction here from the Cook Political Report, it is clear that we do not expect much change from the last election. We do not expect there to be many shockers, many surprises. In fact, if anything, this map is maintaining the status quo. Almost every single state on your screen right now, in fact, every single one with the exception of Maine, and then for the Democrats, I believe, or the Republican states, I believe, with the exception of the states of West Virginia, Ohio, and Montana, the remaining states here that are characterized in their respective columns all have Democrats or Republicans in the U.S. Senate in both Senate seats. Meaning, if that was confusing, because I can imagine how it might come across that way. For instance, the state of Idaho has 2 Republican senators. The state of Oregon has 2 Democratic senators. Point being, ticket splitting doesn't seem to exist too much in these states, which is why we probably won't be seeing them flip in 2024. Politics used to be a lot more swinging in the sense that we saw states that were extremely safe in one regard become competitive in the next election. We don't see that happening with this map. Now, the main takeaway that I get from this is that the Democratic Party is in fact in a much better position than where they should be based off approval rating and based off a number of other metrics that might indicate that President Joe Biden is not on track to win re-election. And those numbers, are not just the level of approval, but also in terms of perception on ability to serve. Is Joe Biden able to serve in terms of the polling question that is asked? There's a significant portion of the American population that says no. In terms of age, which has become a huge factor in the 2020 election and in 2024 around Joe Biden's, again, ability to serve as president of the United States, that also is a factor. On perception of handling the economy, on the perception of handling local issues, international issues, Joe Biden is almost always in the negative. And yet somehow, with an approval rating of just 41% nationwide, he leads the Republican Party in this potential matchup, according to the pundits. Now, some on the right might argue that this is just a bias from the pollsters as it was in 2016, but I look back on 2018, 2020, 2022, when polls started to become more accurate or maybe in some cases underestimated Democrats, and I start to realize that the talking point about these pundits being biased towards Democrats, number one, doesn't serve the pundits in their advantage. What I mean by that is they don't like to be wrong. Even if they personally want the Democrats to win, characterizing them in a favorable setting doesn't change the outcome of the election. It just delegitimizes you for future ones. And the second thing here is that, looking at where we are in terms of ratings, in terms of accuracy, they aren't too far off. The Cook Political Report was quite accurate in the last election. So was Larry Sabato's crystal ball. So was Inside Elections. So were a lot of these pundit firms because they use data and analytics to back up their claims, to back up their characterizations. Now, in terms of these 2024 ones, I wholeheartedly agree. You see, this race has been turned around in favor of Joe Biden by the nature of Donald Trump being the Republican nominee. If it was somebody else, I would be a lot more apprehensive about characterizing these states as Democratic ones. As the states characterized by Cook Political Report or in my own punditry or whatever it might be, we have a general idea that should Donald Trump be renominated, which it looks like is much more likely as the days go on, that Joe Biden is in for one of the more easier possible re-election pathways than if he had to face off against somebody like Senator Tim Scott or Vice President Mike Pence or UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. There's a lot of people on the ballot here on the GOP side that if they made it to the general election, I truly believe would give Joe Biden a run for his money and potentially serve him a defeat, depending on who it is. But based on where we are today with Donald Trump, I do not believe that Donald Trump is on track for victory in the general election, which might be leading the Cook Political Report to lean in one way over the other. For example, Michigan, a state that was decided by 2.8% in the last election, why should anybody assume that when this point in time, when Biden was up 8 points nationally in terms of approval, today he stands down about 13 over a 20-point swing away from him, and yet somehow Michigan is still lean Democrat? It's because of who Joe Biden is expected to run against. Not necessarily because Joe Biden himself, and while the arguments can be made on both sides, that Joe Biden himself alone is carrying himself to this lean Democrat characterization. It's a perfect storm in the 2024 Republican primary, just as it was the perfect storm for the Democrats and Republicans, or for the Democrats to beat the Republicans in 2022 in many of these close and competitive races. So, just to review, Nevada, a state decided by 2.4% of the last election, lean Democrat. Michigan, a state decided by 2.8% in the last election, lean Democrat. Now, you take away the toss-up states, obviously, there's no pathway there for the Democrats, but the pathway becomes increasingly more possible as you start to take a closer look at the outstanding states. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia were all blue states in 2020. In fact, almost all of them were blue states in 2022. Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania have 2 Democratic senators. Wisconsin is split. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona have 3 Democratic governors across them. They're controlled by Democratic governors. Georgia is the only one with a Republican governor. Looking at these states, Pennsylvania, Democrats did well in the House elections there in 2022. Arizona, Democrats did well in the House elections there in 2022. Same thing in Georgia. My point is, Democrats have many possibilities, and because the population growth is benefiting the Democrats in the Atlanta metro area, in the Phoenix metro area, They could win the election without Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. You put Georgia blue, Arizona blue, and Joe Biden wins the election. Now, there's no guarantee that he does, in fact, win these 2 states, win these 4 states, but it becomes easier to see how that might be possible now that we've narrowed it down to these. Because I don't think that Joe Biden is on track to win Texas. I don't think he's on track, quite frankly, to win Florida. I don't think he's going to win Maine's 2nd congressional district. But I do think there's a good possibility that should Donald Trump be the nominee, again, looks like increasingly more likely as the days go on, that the Democratic Party would be able to flip North Carolina and win every single state from the last election. And it looks like in many ways, the Cook Political Report could see that being a possibility. Because they don't characterize North Carolina as much of a swing state as Florida or Texas, because quite frankly, they shouldn't. Florida went to Trump by 3 points in 2020, Texas by 6, North Carolina by just a point. Because you don't see it characterized there, it means that they are recognizing that this state is within reach for the Democratic Party, that this state is winnable for the Democrats, but not necessarily the most likely. I like this map because it puts us in a very realistic situation for 2024. We know that most states aren't going to be changing tides because the candidates aren't going to be changing from the last election. It would be very different if we had a brand new type of Democrat or Republican on the mainstream ballot, if there was somebody different than who people are used to, than who people know. Because it's not always the best thing to be the most recognized or most well-known when it comes down to a presidential election. And I can guarantee you that for a 3rd time in the row, if Donald Trump is on the ballot in 2024, he loses to Joe Biden. He is by far one of the least electable Republicans on the mainstream stage, and yet somehow the majority of the Republican Party believes that he is the most electable, and that's where their pitfall is going to be. Which is exactly why, again, coming to this very big question that people are going to continuously ask and will ask, should Joe Biden win re-election? How does such an unpopular president win re-election? When Barack Obama was disapproved of by just 5 points nationwide, Democrats lost 63 seats in the House. They lost a Massachusetts special election. A Biden plus 30 state, an Obama plus 30 state went red. And then again in 2010. What we should understand and take away from here is that given the right circumstances, there absolutely can be a Republican wave. But the right circumstances are not happening because of who is on the top of the ticket, because of Donald Trump, because of his influence in the down ballot races. As I've been reiterating, that question will be continuously asked, should Joe Biden win the election and should his numbers hold or even grow? He is at a bad point nationwide, on par with where Donald Trump was roughly at this point in time, and yet somehow he leads him and is on track to do even better. Even the mainstream pundits that are typically very averse to characterizing swing states in anything but the toss-up column have confidence that Joe Biden wins Minnesota, wins New Hampshire, wins Michigan, wins Nevada. Not leaving it to entire certainty, but definitely making their mark by at least characterizing it in one column over the other. That is a testament to why this is so important, to why we are looking at it from the lens of a Trump v. Biden rematch and how that is leading this prediction to be so favorable to an unpopular Democratic Party. Especially if things change in favor of President Biden, his electability will only increase. This is the bar. This is the ground. This is, the lowest point that Joe Biden is in terms of approval, at least for quite a while. He's been plateauing at this low point. And if he is at 247 at this low point at 41% approval nationwide, we remember we made videos talking about Joe Biden's approval being at 60%, 55%, 58% for months on end during the honeymoon period in 2021 until the withdrawal from Afghanistan. President Biden was extremely popular. And things have changed. But one thing hasn't. Joe Biden's chances at re-election have maintained themselves, have grown, in fact, with Donald Trump's resurgence as the Republican nominee. And one thing that should terrify the Republican Party is that based off these ratings and based off every other metric that we see, Fundraising numbers with Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis combined, fundraising less than Joe Biden, who isn't even running a robust re-election campaign. Polling numbers, primary numbers, approval numbers. The one thing that I think the Republican Party should fear is that this is where Joe Biden is at a low point. This is where he is when he's disapproved of by 13 points nationwide. And if he's at 247 being down by 12, down by 13, imagine an election where he's down by just 5, or God forbid for the Republican Party, approved of nationwide in the way that he was in 2020, which again would likely result in a victory in all the same states, potentially one more. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.